welcome. My name is Sal Robinson, and with Bill Martin and Monica Zaleska, I run The Bridge, which is the only reading series in New York dedicated to literary translation. I'm very happy to welcome you tonight to the fourth and last event in our spring series, The Business of Literary Translation. Tonight's event is on bookselling, and we have a terrific panel of booksellers and publicists here to share their thoughts and experiences with us, headed by our moderator, Hal Hlavinka. To start things off, I thought I'd just like to read a sentence that I honestly never thought I would see in print from the recently released Nielsen report on book sales in the UK. And some of you may be familiar with it, but if you haven't, it's just come out. There's a sentence in it where it says, on average, translated fiction books sell better than books originally written in English, particularly in the category of literary fiction. This is very surprising. And there's a lot of discussion that we can have about the report, but I would like to point out in the context of this series that the period that this survey covers, 2001 to 2015, and the period in which it found such encouraging sales in translated fiction are exactly the same period in which translators have become more visible, more involved in publication, have received greater recognition, and to some extent better compensation. So I think that's just something that we should keep in mind and talk about. I would like to encourage you to hang out afterwards. There's going to be wine and socializing, and you can get everybody's number and encourage them to sell your books. Yeah, I think that's it. I'm going to welcome up at the moment Alex Zucker from the Penn Translation Committee to talk a little bit about what they do.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Alex Zucker. Together with Allison Markin Powell here, I co-chair the PEN America Translation Committee. And before we go any further, I wanted to thank the Center for Fiction for hosting us during this series of events. First of all, Laura Cox, who's the events producer, who's been staying late and been a super gracious and welcoming and well-organized host. Noreen Tomasi, the executive director of the center. Amanda Patton, who's a digital media assistant and kids read coordinator. John Michaud, John's downstairs, I don't know if I'm saying your name right, John. The head librarian, and Kelly Barnett, the production assistant. It's been really great to have the series here, and for those of you who don't know, we've had one event every month for 4 months running, so this is the last one. The other events you can find on video on the Center for Fiction's website or on their YouTube channel. So the PEN America Translation Committee advocates on behalf of literary translators, working to foster a wider understanding of their art and offering professional resources for translators, publishers, critics, bloggers, and others with an interest in international literature. We don't have any events coming up right now. Thankfully, we've had a super busy spring with a lot of events. We're going to be we're not going to be on hiatus for the summer, but we don't have any public events coming up in the summer. But we have ongoing projects. Our ongoing projects include a new subcommittee on free expression, looking for literary translators who are being persecuted. So far in the case report, we haven't found any. And engaging publishers looking for ways to advance the interests of translators at the same time that we support the publishers who bring out our books. Our website is pen.org/translation. There you can find the only model contract for literary translation here in the United States, plus FAQs on contracts and literary translation in general. To join PEN, you need one book published to join the PEN America. You can go to pen.org/FAQ to find out more about membership. So Sal already mentioned the unstoppable tide of literary translation as evidenced by the new report from the Man Booker Prize. With regard to what we're talking about tonight, bookselling, there's a quote that I've adopted for use thanks to Susan Bernofsky, who wrote this up in a blog post from the 2012 ALTA conference. Jeffrey Leppendorf, who's the executive director of the Community of Literary Magazines and Presses, said, "Until a book has reached the reader's hands, it has not yet been published, only printed." So tonight we're going to hear about how books reach readers' hands. That's it. Thanks.
So you've already heard about breaking into the industry, and you've heard about editing, and there was a contracts bloodbath. So now we're gonna talk about the hard, cold, alien face of the market that we represent. No. We're all very nice, and this whole process is great. And as we've heard, at least in the UK, stats are up. I'll get a little bit further into this as we go on. I actually pulled some stats from my store to kind of compare those, and things are looking good. So in lieu of introductions, I was just going to ask that our panelists introduce themselves and then give us a little bit about how they came to where they are now through the industry, and where your interest in international literature and translation has sort of come about. So Miriam, do you want to start?
Yes, so I'm Miriam. I work at Albertine, the French bookstore on Fifth Avenue. And I started my career 20 years ago. I started with publicity, where I was in charge of promoting foreign literature for a French publisher. And I've done that for 8 years. I thought it was extremely fun. And then I decided to learn more about. I was really frustrated by the lack of space in the media for foreign literature. And at that time, I thought that the US was much more advanced in promoting books on the internet, using the internet. I mean, there were a lot of smaller publishers who were very active. So I decided to come here and learn with them. And so I studied at NYU, I interned with Melville and in a few other places, Melville House, sorry. And then I decided that I liked it here better. And I was lucky enough to find a job in bookselling. So that's it.
Okay. My name's Becky Kraemer. I'm not a bookseller per se in a physical store, but I am a literary publicist. I always wanted to. Most people say they started in book publishing because it was an accident, or they couldn't find a job, or they just didn't know what they wanted to do. But I always wanted to work in book publishing. I moved to New York to work in book publishing. I took a job. Somebody hired a temp until I got there to work in book publishing. I was so desperate to be part of this community. And while I always read literary fiction and worked with adult books, I worked in rights for my first job just to kind of be in the community. And it was a very helpful place to start. So in doing rights, I sold magazines, serials, and things. I moved on also to Melville House after a few years working at big houses because I liked the idea of doing everything for a book. And I did a lot of translation things at Melville House. And I did everything there and found that I actually really liked the publicity element as well. So then I started my own business, and now I have several clients and I help them bring translated books to the United States and Canada.
My name is Kate Garber. I started in bookselling in sort of that accidental way. After graduating with an English degree, I thought I'll probably go to grad school, study literature, work in publishing or whatever. I moved to Boston, got a job at the Harvard Coop in Cambridge, and had a manager at that bookstore who was entirely devoted to being a lifetime bookseller. And it was so beautiful to see his passion for it as something that could be a long-term career, that he sort of inspired me to continue on. So I moved to New York 4.5 years later. I got a job at the Strand because that's a place where they always have jobs open. I was there for 1.5 years and then moved over to manage 192 Books in Chelsea. And I'd say my interest in literature and translation probably just started in the sense that after college, when I was working at the Harvard Coop, most of the books that I happened to be reading and loving were works in translation. So I was like a young baby bookseller discovering Alberto Moravia and Alain Robbe-Grillet and sort of 20th century things that were really exciting to discover. So just kept loving them and not loving all of the, happening to read books in English that I didn't love as much. So it just sort of maybe accidentally went in that direction.
You can just replace her bio with my name. And I graduated with an English degree. I wanted to be a graduate student, and that just didn't go my way. And I decided to be a bookseller and kind of stayed the course through Chicago and then into New York. And along the way, you start discovering as an independent bookseller, and you carry really great stuff, that the same great publishers tend to publish the great books, and a lot of those publishers also tend to dabble in translation. And over time, I'm speaking to a room that already knows this. The stuff in translation tends to be proportionally more interesting than a lot of what's coming out now. So, you make your way to it. Okay, so I'm going to jump right back into that Man Booker Nielsen stat. I'm going to read a different sentence that preceded Sal's directly. I had first. We discussed this. We worked this out. The findings show that the proportion of translated fiction published remains extremely low at 1.5% overall and 3.5% of literary fiction. However, in terms of sales, fiction punches well above its weight, with translated fiction providing 5% of total fiction sales in 2015 and translated literary fiction making up 7% of literary fiction sales in 2015, which means that on average, translated fiction books are selling better than books originally written in English. And I wanted to see if this also held true for our store, which of course this is not a bubble for America. An independent bookstore in Park Slope is definitely its own beast. But I pulled our numbers for our top 20 books, because to go through, we don't separate our books for translation, so it would be a record of going through about 50,000 books and trying to figure out what's in translation. But of the top 20, 64% of those, in terms of units sold, are in translation. Now, guess how many of those are Ferrante novels?
That's the question.
The top 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the Ferrante series. But of course, has it been your experience? What I didn't ask you to pull numbers, so I'm kind of.
I pulled
cheating.
numbers.
You pulled numbers.
Yeah.
Kate pulled numbers. Kate, what's your?
So I discovered I actually did one of those absurd things I like to do, and I printed out a list of all of the fiction we've sold in 2016. Separated translated fiction from fiction written in English, and I discovered that 45% of the units were in translation. Quite a few were Ferrante. Like, our best-selling was My Brilliant Friend still this year, but at the same time, it wasn't hugely, she was not, wait, I'm gonna find this. She was not, if you guys wanna go, I'm gonna look and see my
the only thing that
details.
I will say is that now I'm not a bookseller, so I have no numbers to pull, don't worry. But I've just heard the names, Kate, that you've said that you personally love, and you're working in a store where you're personally recommending titles. So it does make a lot of sense to me that someone's coming into your store and you're saying, oh, if you like that book, you would like this book as well, and it's also translation. And I do think that can skew higher in an indie store. I think across America, you're walking in a Barnes & Noble, you don't have a bookseller there saying, oh, if you like that book, here, check out this Czechoslovakian novel. It doesn't happen as often. So I think that's an interesting thing to talk about too, because I do think, especially living in New York, working in New York, Los Angeles, the coast, people have a higher propensity to seek these titles out. And I don't necessarily think that's always the case, except for Ferrante across the country. So it looks like you found your number, so I'll let you talk now.
Oh, yeah, just, and we don't sell a huge number of any given novel, because I feel that part of my duty is to sell things that need help being sold. So if we have a best-selling novel that's best-selling in a lot of places, I don't make that our focus. I would rather focus on selling things that don't necessarily get as much support. So we have a huge number of titles that sell, but I did discover, so My Brilliant Friend was our best-selling title, Ferrante was our best-selling author in the translation side. Liz Spector was far under Ferrante, but still very strong. And we've sold a lot of Modiano because of the, I'm sure we'll get into that, but yeah, only two of our top 10 titles were Ferrante. So,
Miriam, what's your experience been?
my experience is really weird because it's completely reverse. We sell French books in French mostly, and I think that if you look at the fiction, we look at the number before coming, 20% of the fiction is actually French literature translated into English. So you're completely on the other spectrum. But it's true. I mean, I share the experience that the sales are really concentrated towards a few, like for 10 titles more or less, and there's, I think we do our margins on we play our year on 10, 15 titles more or less. So, and I think that's also what's the survey reflects the fact that translation sells more. If you say that translation sells more than books written in English, it's also because you translate so few, and in these very few numbers, you have a few bestsellers, and these bestsellers will sell so much that their own success will make the translations looks attractive. But if you look at the number of all the other translations that don't sell, they're very, very low. And there's quite many translations that still don't sell. And I think we should really focus our attention on things that don't sell, and how, like Kate said, what do you do to give them more visibility, to make them attractive? What kind of narrative you build around them to make to pull the reader to them? So more than focusing on because in that success, for instance, I'm sure you have the Ferrante, you have Siglassen, you have this kind of huge bestsellers that kind of hide the real business of the real numbers of what it is to translate, what it is to publish translation and to sell translation. That's my.
Well, I did ask you guys to consider titles that you do love to hand sell. If we could also sort of in a more broad sense talk about the units that a bookseller can push, because I do think that there is across much of the industry a blindness to how much just one bookseller getting behind a book can really affect sales. And what happens when one bookseller gets behind a book is twofold. Their friends at the bookstore also read the book and typically get behind it, if you have good taste. But then there's also a phenomenon, especially I've noticed in New York and in Chicago where I've worked, where you will develop customers that come to you that respect your taste and that respect where you are going to lead them next in their reading. So Miriam, do you want to talk about some maybe a title or two that is from what you're talking about, that's sort of not the Ferrante that is this Broadway splash, but
so there's many. I mean, I could spot one. Yeah, I have. For instance, I fell in love last year with Love, Madness, and a beautiful novel translated from the Haitian by a writer who was dead. So it's not really easy. It's not an easy sell, for instance. But yeah, what you do, you just. I mean, what we all do, you build a narrative. You try to explain why this story will tell something, will appeal, has something to tell you. And you really have to go specific. I mean, when you're a bookseller, when you're a publicist, I think that's the only thing. You have to go to the heart of the reader and say, that's for you. You will like it. Just give it a chance. And you try to build a sexy little pitch and try to make it better. And that's it. It's And of course, so this pitch now with internet is great for that, because you have all, yes, it offers you space to share it and to try to connect other readers to it and to increase its visibility. But at the core of the work is still, I haven't found anything better.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think? I'll get to you last because you've got a different thing.
Okay.
I'm more, like, I love hand selling things. I love telling people what I love. I think my real passion in book selling is finding ways to manipulate people into buying books, even without my specific hand selling. So just some of the, I don't know, we have at 192 Books, we have a whole table and section dedicated to works in translation. And there are just these little things that maybe don't make a difference, but I feel like they make a difference, is putting the Ferrante books on that table rather than putting them on like new great fiction. Because people know of the Ferrante books, they look like a light read, and having those next to like Elsa Morante, you know, like that sort of, I feel like it's a subtle manipulative technique that gets people buying the things that maybe they actually want. Also, you know, having really intense, you know, things very few people are going to want to read, and like I wouldn't recommend because they're a struggle, and you know, a really good struggle, but you can't recommend them to everyone. Having those also surrounding, like for example, something we've done really well with is the Estonian book The Man Who Spoke Sneakish, which has this like fantasy cover. Like it looks like we wouldn't sell that if it were on like a new fiction table, but having it on our translation table surrounded by, you know, whatever, you know, it's probably next to like, you know, a lame rogue groulet right now, I think, or something. And it points out to readers that this isn't just a fun novel. It is a fun novel, it's a great novel, but also its great element is that it does something to express an Estonian soul really well. Like, not that I know anything about Estonia, but it feels...
Precisely, that's why you
Right.
want to read it. You
Yeah,
want
yeah.
to know about an Estonian soul.
Exactly.
Now I want to know about it.
You have to.
I'm coming to the store. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, regarding hand selling, like, the easiest book for me to hand sell, and that gets me the most return customers saying, you have really great taste, like, tell me something else, is Bohemian Hrabel's I Serve the King of England.
Oh yeah, that's my number one too.
Like, you can't fail with it. You just say, oh, you want one of the greatest novels ever written, read this. Everyone comes back and says, I love that.
Yeah,
What else should I
one
read
time
next?
Put it in John Green's hands. He was at our store, and he was like, I need a book. And so I gave him that. And then years later, he reported back in a BuzzFeed article that he had been handed I Serve the King of England by an unnamed bookseller. But still, I Serve the
now
King of
you
England
all
got
know.
some great hits from that. You know? And then the YA audience gets into it, and that's where the real money is. Becky, do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah, you were just saying how, you know, the power of one bookseller. It's absolutely true. As a publicist, I do target booksellers, even though that usually in a larger house falls more to a marketing department. It's not always publicists, but publicists who do a lot of translation do target booksellers, so expect to be getting a lot more books from me, ladies. But no, and it really is about, it's the same thing that you're talking about, but at a business-to-business kind of situation. You're selling to the customer, I'm selling to you, and I'm trying to make the connection with you that you're making with the customer. And I'm trying to understand what you like as a bookseller so that I can say to you, here's what this is. It may not be personally for you, but if you have customers who like this author and this author and this author, they will like this book. Or if you have customers who like this experience of reading, you know, women in this area, then they will like this book. And it really is about that personal connection, even from a publicity standpoint, not only with booksellers, but also with media. I'm reaching out to media who covers books in translation and saying to them, if you liked this book, or if you like these kinds of books, even if they're not translation, you'll like this book, because even though it's from Spain, it's still about these themes, and your readers like these themes, and this you should pay attention to. I'm building a narrative for that author. I'm building a narrative for that translator increasingly. I've been very fortunate to work with a lot of authors who speak English. I was talking about this earlier, and I've been able to bring them over, especially to New York, because you can get national media just from New York being here. And having them speak English, having them have a conversation with their translator is invaluable. It's an insight into the process that appeals to everyone: media, book buyer, bookseller. You know, it's a conversation that they're having about this work of art, and it's fascinating. And I try to get people excited about that. Let's find out more about not only what this book means in this country, but the American perspective, or the British perspective, or the English-speaking perspective on what these themes are. How would this be different if it were written in English? Why is it not different? What does it say about who we are as people, and the big themes as well as the small themes? So yes, booksellers have immense power, especially independent booksellers when it comes to translation. I don't think that's always filtered out to the masses, but I did have success with a book this past fall that reached a huge audience for a translated book in the middle of the country. And I do think that's because it had another big advocate in an area that was a little bit niche. It was around religion. It was a book about, it was called Laris. It was a Russian novel about a medieval man, and it had elements of fantasy in it, and it just had so many different things that I could sell. So if you liked fantasy, you'd like it. If you like medieval things, you'd like it. If you liked Orthodox religion, you would like it. But the Orthodox community really surrounded it in a way I didn't expect them to, because there were some kind of provocative parts. But it had some very vocal advocates for it in the online community and in the Orthodox community, and it continues to sell now. And I think just trying to hit every possible audience that could like a book, just like what a bookseller does, every possible customer, I'm trying to reach every possible media outlet and every bookseller and everybody, is all you can do to help spread the word, and it does make a difference.
So to start talking a little bit more particularly about strategies of hand selling, book selling, and to sort of get into this phenomenon that I've discovered at various stores, and stores in New York, it happens everywhere, is the compartmentalization of translation titles. We have a lot to say about this actually at Winter Institute this year, one of the big conferences for booksellers, trying to convince a lot of stores that translated titles don't necessarily need to be placed apart, that they can be sold right alongside books that are not in translation. You do occasionally get a customer that quite literally will just say, I do not want something in translation, and you respect that bizarre aim. But how do you guys fight that in your store? Like, what are some of the strategies that you kind of use to make sure that people aren't treating translation as a this rare jewel that they will occasionally adorn, instead of just picking up whatever is top 10 or hot in English? I can give you an example if you want to.
Sure.
Well,
I have something to say, but I would like an example first.
Well, I was just going to say that we break out our small presses, and that really helps people. The small press stuff is in translation sometimes, but it's not in translation. But people love looking at the spines of the NYRB section or stuff like that, and that really helps draw attention. And then suddenly they're shopping by the beautiful spines instead of the author's nationality or something like that.
Yeah.
By way of example.
I was just thinking about this recently because I was realizing, okay, we have we have a lot of fiction on our fiction and translation table and on the shelves next to that. And I was thinking about it, do we want to separate these? Why are we doing this? It is very beneficial for browsing for people who are looking for literature and translation. I know people love it. It's a place to put really cool books, because we only carry really cool books. But I was realizing that one reason I'm okay with it is when I started at 192, in my interview, I was having a conversation with the owner, Paula Cooper, and she owns the bookstore with her husband, Jack McRae. And the bookstore has been here for 13 years, and I'm I've been in bookselling for 9 years or something, so I'm still pretty much a baby bookseller, in the history of the printed, contemporary novels or something. And she was telling me about how the store has a history of promoting literature and translation ever since it first started. So they always had a section to promote literature and translation from back before I was a bookseller, when it was so rare. Before we had all of these small presses, and before we had, panel discussions on literature and translation. And I feel like I respect the literature and translation table because of its history, which is a weird, I don't know that it means anything, but it's like a history of look how far we've come or something. And it's not a practical thing, but it feels like there's something spiritual about it in our shop, that it just sort of has this great thing. I don't know. And we put a lot of the canon in our regular fiction section, because we know if someone's looking for Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, they're just going to go to fiction. They're not going to check the translated section. So we want to help make it easy. And I switch what's between there. Sometimes Jean Genet is in regular fiction, sometimes in translation. But I don't know. I don't remember if that's exactly what you asked,
No,
but
no.
it's just a thing I've been thinking about.
Well, one thing that I was interested in trying to tease out, which is a little bit more provocative, is you like that? No, is that there's this weird balance when you're at a bookstore between the sort of the pull of the exotic appeal and then the quality appeal. And you as a bookseller are always really trying to go on that quality appeal. But there are definitely times when you're sort of like, well, wouldn't you love to read a book originally written in Chinese? Like, isn't that quite an interesting thing to try on for a change? Mm-hmm. But that feels kind of awkward because you want to resist the sort of exoticism of the translation. Do you guys feel this? Miriam?
I think when you're a bookseller, you want to understand what the person facing you wants to read. Actually, you want to please her because you want her to come back. Or him to come back first. That's a rule. And so, no, I think you don't. I don't necessarily want the person to live with a book that I judge good because my standards are what they are, but I want her I want him to live with something that he will enjoy. So first thing is you try to narrow down what his expectation are. And some will come to you and say, okay, I'm going to travel to Mexico. I would like to read a novel that takes place to Mexico. And why not? If it's literature is also here to help you discover the word or understand the word in a way that even by traveling you won't get. So why? I mean, it's totally fine by me, and I will just help her. So someone who wants to know, and I don't think we have a small okay. And second of all, again, people come to Aberdeen to buy books in French, so they don't. I mean, in our store, literature and translation is a second choice. But sometimes they will just say, okay, I'm tired of French literature. I want a good story, a good narrative, something that will just take me away. What do you have? And then we go through the word literature, and usually their barrier just fall down, and that's a good moment to give them a book translated from Japanese or Chinese or whatever language you want, exotic or not. But first of all, it's trying to connect to the person and not judge.
Yeah, and I've never encountered someone who I felt like when I was trying to connect with them that they were looking for the exotic. Like I don't feel like I've ever encountered that.
Sure.
If somebody wants to read something in translation, it seems because they want to, actually better themselves and get a better sense of the world, or they just want a good book. Sure. I've just never encountered. Have you encountered?
Well, I mean, I'm just sort of talking about your own subject position, trying to sort of like not exactly exoticize something while trying to make sure that someone with it.
Well, one of the ways that some publishers do this, and this is particularly important given the stats are from the UK. I have a client as a UK publisher, and we talked about this a little bit before this meeting started. Sometimes they don't put translators' names on covers, at least not on the front. So if you're a bookseller and you're opening up this book, unless you go look up in the system who the translator is or look in the flap, you might not even realize it is a translated book in the UK. Now, there's a whole set of reasons why this is a bad thing and not something that should be encouraged, I guess, or at least in the translation community, because you want the translator to get the credit and be paid for the work that they've done. But it really brings up an interesting story. If there's not a translator's name on it and it's on a table and it's not on a translation table, what is to say that you even know, that that's a book that's in translation?
Sure.
And what does it matter? So I think that's an interesting and very provocative question of whether or not the book is better served by having it or not having it. I do think these days we're getting to the point where we should be able to have it, at least in the US. I think it's almost always the translator's name is on the cover.
And then having it won't actually affect any approach to the book that a customer might take.
I mean, I don't know, as I'm not a bookseller, but I know that, I wonder as a reader if that matters to you as a bookseller. I mean, do you feel like it would make it easier if it wasn't on there? Or does it matter to you at all?
I mean, I don't think it matters, but I live in Brooklyn.
Clark Slope, yes.
And another thing similar is that I always, if I were in charge of all of publishing, I would require, And this, there are two things. One unrelated is that nonfiction books would always have the subtitle on the spine because otherwise you have no idea what it's about.
No.
That's, I'm sure you understand. But the other is that you would have translated from which language by on the cover. Because I don't think it's weird to try to read from a certain country.
Sure.
Like when you're reading, maybe you just read a book translated from the Hungarian, now you want a book translated from the Chinese, next you want something translated from the Spanish, because you do want to sort of diversify. And sometimes you want to read every book translated from the Czech. But like either way is okay.
We definitely have customers that focus.
Yeah. Any ways that trigger your curiosity is good to,
Exactly.
to explore. I think it's not a... But it's funny, when I was a student, I was doing I was preparing I was writing my final paper, and I had a survey to do. So I was interviewing readers in bookstore and asking them about how they feel about translation. And 40% of them had absolutely didn't care if the book was translated or not. And I think that 15% were looking for specific, wanted to read about specific place, so would go for specific translation, and something like 10 or 13% didn't want to have anything to do with translation, because they saw that it had to be better. It was worse than the original. So they wanted to read the original. Because a translation couldn't be as good as the original. So I asked him, why do you say that? Because obviously he hadn't read any translation. It's obvious. Okay. Yeah, because it's
that whole thing is done.
It was very funny. I mean, that saying that people who read actually don't care about where do they read from. I mean, it's more or less. It really is something. I think it is a concern. Or at least now, it is more a concern for publishers than for readers.
Yeah.
They're way more open to.
It's interesting.
So I just realized that we are really burning through time, so I want to jump on two other topics real quick. One was a question from Margaret Carson, who couldn't be here tonight, from the Translation Committee. Is the run-up to an announcement of a prize, such as the Man Booker, which was just announced, the PEN Translation Prize, the BTBA prizes that focus on translation, is the run-up to those followed in the bookselling world? What impact do those awards have, and what can prize-giving organizations do to enhance the prizes based on those sales? Kate, what do you think? You were on the Best Translated Book Award committee this year.
Yeah.
So what did you see between your store and the sort of build-up to the prize?
I mean, we, once we had the long list determined, I made sure we had all of those books in stock. And, partially that's because like the nice thing about a long list is that a lot of people loved this book. Like a lot of good readers love this book. So that if you display it, people probably won't be disappointed. It's that sort of, not necessarily not because anybody came in and asked. Nobody came in and said, I saw this on the long list.
We do have a customer that comes in and buys all of the Best Translated books, but again, Brooklyn Parcel. She's great. Miriam, what about you? What have you seen? Did you guys see a bump with the prizes?
We saw a bump with the Nobel Prize, of course, with Modiano, and we're very grateful to it because it was a lot at the beginning. But other than that, we saw an impact with French prize, of course, but with American prize, not that much. A little bit for the Pulitzer and National Book Award, but it's very, like 2 or 3 more than they would.
What about the Nobel Prize, though? Since those are typically, not for you.
It keeps going. I mean, every time we put a pile of Modiano, 2 days later,
totally
there's none. Yes, they're gone. So
it does. I have found that it does really matter. We were actually talking about this before we came. That it does really matter where the author wins Nobel Prize is from. It's very hard to sell Moyan, I have found, of all things. But it is not hard at all to sell Patrick Modiano. And when I say to sell, I don't even mean putting books in people's hands. I mean you set out the Nobel Prize stacks where you don't even touch the thing. The Alexeyevich, we have sold quite a bit of the Chernobyl. The Modiano definitely was a little bit more.
The Moyan is interesting to me because I found that American media is fascinated with China. So I get a lot of Chinese interest in Chinese translation. We just had a Chinese author actually at the Center for Fiction last spring who was here for BEA because China was the guest of honor, and there was a lot of controversy around that. And I can get a lot of media, but it's interesting that you say that about the sales, that the sales aren't there, because I have the feeling that most Americans are very curious about what it's like to live in China. And I love this novel and this novelist, and he's kind of an up-and-coming novelist. And the book was even written in a very Western style. He cites Dostoevsky and various Western forms as his inspiration. So it was almost, you could even almost say, if you really don't want to read a Chinese novel, but you do want to say you've read a Chinese novel, you could read this novel. I mean,
We do everything to get a sale.
you do everything. I mean, to the people who wouldn't want to read it, I could say that, but to the people who really want to read something from China, I could stress how literary he was, and he worked as a Chinese police officer. I mean, it's fascinating. There were so many things I could say about this. But the media in general, I find, loves China.
Sure.
So sometimes it's true, I can get publicity, and that doesn't always translate to sales.
Yeah.
It is a horrific conundrum that needs to stop right now.
Even, related to China, this is such a weird thing. I have been trying to hand sell Jan Lianke's The Four Books.
Yeah.
Like, I have been trying so hard. I've put it on every table. I've talked to people about it. It was on the Best Translated Book Award long list. It's on the short list for the Man Booker International. No one will buy it. And I don't know what it is. I don't know. But yeah, it's one of those interesting things. Like, you wonder, what's the reason?
You pick up any publication, and there are journalists dedicated to covering just China. So it is fascinating to me. And the literature, it's lovely and interesting and crazy and unique. It's worth reading, of course.
People will buy nonfiction about China at my bookstore, like
Yeah.
histories of China and contemporary issues. That's it.
I do a lot of events in our store, so I'm just going to change the topic again and talk about events. What have you guys found works when you are doing events for works in translation? I'm talking about events in which you have the actual original author, and events in which you don't have the original author and you have the translator, and sometimes events in which you don't have either and you have maybe some experts or some translators talking about a work of translated fiction. What have you guys seen that has worked for you?
Champagne.
Champagne. There you have it. We're done.
That's just like a life strategy. I mean, that's just like, that makes life work. So
And then
just
everybody
do it.
buys the book.
We're going to open up a bookstore.
No one can answer better than that. No. Honestly, I think just doing events, trying to get the translators here, trying to get the authors here, getting the translators here. However you can get it done, just doing it, especially for publicity. To have an event means that then there is a reason to talk about it. To not have an event and just try to get publicity around the publication of the book does not always result in a lot of attention these days. The press wants to tie everything to something newsworthy. So I'm always advocating to get whatever I can get. If it's just the translator, I'll do something in their library in their hometown, and I'll try to do something with their independent bookstore, and I try to get them to write. I really try to use translators as much as I possibly can. For authors who speak English, I try to get them over here in a book festival, for the Brooklyn Book Festival, for the Penn World Voices Festival, for the Russian Literature Week, anything that I can do. You know, the Paris Review now is doing Nordic Fiction Week. I mean, you're starting to see...
Knausgaard will be at 192 on Friday.
Actually, he's like in every event. Yeah, so he's in every event. He's all over. But only come to this one.
Yeah.
No, but anything like that where I can tie something in to do it, it does help with getting the media, and it helps to get people talking about the book.
Okay, what about Noel?
We do quite a few translated events. We always have a decent amount of success, especially if we're doing it with a small press like Archipelago, because they'll have their networks and people follow these presses. It's most successful either when the author has a strong tie to the community, like if they know a lot of people, or if there's a specific group that you've identified, like we did Bulgarian Fiction Night a couple times, and the Elizabeth Kostova Center just brought everybody related to that, and it was just totally
The
packed.
Bulgarians will hang out.
Yeah, great. But then also, I think part of my favorite event we've ever had was when Emmanuel Carrera's Limonov was coming out, and there had been before I saw that this new book was coming out, I'd heard from a number of French people randomly, like in a short period of time, talking about him and how, like, I'd never heard of him, several years ago, talking about how he is like the biggest thing in France, that no one has not heard of him in France. And identifying someone that people love in the original language and country. When he came, it was totally packed. Like there was no room. And we got behind it because I read everything he wrote and I just fucking loved him. So that was like my most exciting things.
Yeah.
Because everybody came.
There's an electricity in the room.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really try to get across to the small presses when we're booking programs and large presses, frankly, the big six would sometimes need to be told this too, is that when you book an event with an indie, we're deciding to book an event with you many times because we are into the title. We're not just sort of taking this thing because we're expecting it to pay our rent. Sometimes it does pay our rent if it's big, but rarely does it pay the rent. But part of that is that we're going to be ordering a lot of books. We're going to be behind this title. We're all going to read it, or a lot of us are going to read it. We all have a lot of different tastes. But we're going to sell the book before the event. We're going to sell the book at the event. We're going to sell the book after the event. This book is going to have a life at the store.
We're going to sell the backlist for the months preceding its publication.
Yeah. So there's a whole life that a book in translation, a book, and an author that's just breaking into a U.S. audience can find at indie bookstores that I feel like is sort of overlooked in the industry. People kind of focus on getting that one big event and hopefully selling a lot of copies of that, which is always great, and you always want to sell a lot of copies that night. But there's a life span of these books.
And I have to say that also, I think you're very lucky because you have you have a community of writers that is extremely involved in the literary life and very they really make themselves available for events for other. For us, we really rely on them to come and talk with a completely unknown French writer.
Totally.
And they always find someone who comes and really speak with. Not only intelligence but a lot of heart and warmth, and that's what makes our event successful, and that's what help us fidelize our audience completely. And that's such. In France you don't get that. You would have. You would find a French writer for Delilo or Philip Ross or something like that, but because it also helps their ego. But
in New York, we
it's
love
way and I think it's it's something that really amazed me. The generosity, the generosity. It's so.
We can go out right now and find 6 events in conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Very
and it takes time. It takes time because they have to read the books, they have to come. It really is an involvement.
I want to get to questions very soon, but I want to get on one more thing, which is that I think that we should touch on gender and race in translation. Have you seen any trends with regards to this, in whether it be sales, whether it be in the marketing of books, whether it's one thing that I'll point out is there's this sort of misguided notion that the Ferrante books are for women, which we get at our store all the time. We will have male customers come to the register buying it. They're like, "Oh, it's my wife," and we're like, "We all read it, and it was fantastic," And so there's part of this is heavily in the marketing. It's in the covers of books. But I don't know. It's complicated. So I don't really know how we're going to stab at this, but I wondered if you guys... Becky,
I can say, I'm noticing a trend not just in translated books, but it spills over into translated books of people who want to read books by women who are underrepresented in general in the literary marketplace as far as reviews are concerned, and women of color. And I just hear this all of the time from people who are interested, and I get media feedback that they are more excited about these kinds of books, and that works well for translation. So you've got books from, I'm working on this book from Mexico right now, that's of interest because it's written by a woman and it's translated by a woman. But in general, I think that is the feeling in America across the board in the literary centers. I don't know necessarily about it in the Heartland again. I think that it's of interest, but with Beyonce and feminism in general. Like I think women are definitely, that's what people are into these days. It's
All
a little
colors
easier
with
to
Beyonce.
sell to the well, if it was Beyonce, yes, it would all be fine. But it's easier for me to go to the media and say this is a book by a woman, and they're more interested because that's what people are writing and talking about. And I think it is the same for translation. But I wouldn't say that I necessarily see any particular patterns right now with who's getting what attention
Sure.
in the translation community outside of just what's generally in the general media in the U.S.
Well, maybe a way of coming at this differently is, do you ever see any correlation between sort of world events, good or bad, that oddly drive sales? Gosh, that sounds really like a Dr. Little novel right here, but
No, it's. It's always. I think. This festival, it's always an affair of seduction. It's. For instance, Delataya was invited by the Pan Festival, and last weekend we had 5 persons came into the store asking for his books, which never happened before. Nobody knew about him, and but because he was he's extremely charming and good and yes, and they wanted to. So yes, it helps of course, and it triggers sales, but. After that, you have for the thing of gender and race. It's tricky. Of course, it's easier. I mean, in France at least, it has been way easier to translate, to publish an American writer who was white and Caucasian and male. But now. I think now it's not that much the case. It's people are aware of it and they try, and I think publishers try they try to find good books, good stories, and things that will fit into their line and that they will be able to sell. But not. I don't think that it's. I think that the situation has changed over the past 20 years, and I think you have to be careful of that. I don't know if you've read Erasure by Percival Howard, which is hilarious, and it's that's exactly what it is about. You really have to be careful. And on one side, as in the other, what do you really expect someone? I mean, coming from a certain community, because once you put people in community, then you start expecting them to write that certain kind of stories, and that could be that can end up into the worst situation. I think.
Okay. If we leave you with one thing, Percival Everett's Erasure, it's not a translation, so that's not
no, it's not a translation, but it's the idea of a black
There
man
are some good
writing
books
about
written
it.
in English.
There are some good books.
They're like two good English books. To your point about current events, I try so hard when there are things happening, and sometimes it's even just fate. I'm working on a book and something happens in current events, and last spring was a really big one for me. I was working on a novel that dealt with refugees, and it was a novel in translation, and there were other issues that kind of came about, but I tried so hard to get attention for that book based on all of the things that were happening with the refugee situation and in Libya and things, and I failed. I could not get traction for that book, and it breaks my heart to this day that I couldn't get those two things connected. So as much as I like to say, and we all like to say, and it's very true, that reading novels is the best way to understand the mindset of a people, more so sometimes than the headlines, because you really have that empathetic feeling of being inside someone's head. It does not always translate to publicity to get at least novels in a breaking news cycle, sure. As much as I try. Very different, all different ways. They don't want to hear from a novelist about a breaking news situation. Now, as a bookseller, you could say, if you're interested in this current events, read this novel. It will also give you a fascinating perspective and insight. But as a publicist, to go out to the media, sometimes someone will do like a book review of books about a particular thing, but that takes time. You have to read the book, you have to ruminate on it, you have to know what you're doing, or it might already have been in the pipeline and something happens and then it gets pushed out. But if something's just breaking, it doesn't always work as much as I would like it to.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to questions. Unless you guys have anything else pressing to say. We are here to be your friends, translators.
I'm wondering a couple of things about dead authors, for example. I translated a 1932 novel by an author who's no longer alive from Catalan, and it had wonderful pre-publication reviews. I'm sorry to use myself, but it's an example. And I have a general question at the end. But it didn't have any reviews from the time it was actually published and on the shelves. So I'm wondering, why would people even look at that book? It's on shelves, but if there aren't reviews, and if there maybe aren't events, what can a translator do? The general question is, what can a translator do to help the booksellers? To give you information about the book that would make it possible for you to seduce people into reading it. Or can we?
Can. A lot of it is getting something in our hands. We get thousands of things for free all the time. I'll take food and beer and anything that you want to give me for free, but we get books for free a lot.
Champagne.
But if you can get it in our hands and make it visible to us, and if it is of interest to anyone, I was clearing out our galley rack the other day and just randomly fell upon this bizarre little thing that I was definitely about to donate. It wasn't put in my hands. So if someone could just put that in my hands, whether it's a publicist, whether you just send it to the store and sort of, a good thing to always do is to look up, if you're sending something to a bookstore, to kind of make yourself a little bit acquainted with the staff there so that you send it to the right person, because if you get it in the wrong hands again, it's just going to kind of disappear into the void. Miriam, what were you going to say?
Yes, for instance, if you know that a few writers who've been writing about that book, or about the author, or any materials that we can use to tell our customers and to any any credentials, that's always helpful for from a lesser known languages. Yeah, but sometimes even
Catalan.
Catalan's pretty hot right now.
Yeah.
Well, relatively speaking.
It's true.
This season.
And did you do Private Life?
Yes.
Was that yours?
Yes. Anyway, well, thank you. No, I'll definitely write to it.
We have plenty of private life, but
Yeah, a lot of it is maybe just, I have no idea how this works, but a lot of it is just what the publisher decides to put, as you're saying, like as the text on the book, or like and the cover, and I think like saying translated from the Catalan, like that specifically on the cover would be nice. I don't know why Private Life is selling. It's selling at my store. It's a thick book. People wouldn't necessarily pick it up. It is sitting kind of close to on my table to the Archipelago My Struggles.
Dangerous.
So maybe there's like a subconscious like, oh, this is a big book from the same. I don't know. But it's doing well.
We had Tony Sala for his book The Boys, which was came out from 2 Lines this year. So it might have been lovely to have you on for that program. So one thing that you can do is kind of look who's coming, who is going to be speaking. I know that he's a fan of Private Life too, and that kind of look at who's going to be talking in the area, and have your publisher reach out and see if you can join the event just as a moderator or just a participant or something like that. That's a great way of generating some buzz, at least in a small community. Yeah.
Question about more publicists than anything else, the fragmentation of the environment. There, the big six have kind of pulled back, and so a lot of indie presses have sprouted up to fill the gap. The same has happened with the indie bookstores, with the closing of the borders, and the review environment is fragmented as well, with a lot of upstarts who are establishing themselves, while the major presses are kind of pulling back on their book coverage. How do you deal with this sort of fragmentation of the entire media environment?
Well, I cry every day about book reviews. There's just that. Every day I wake up weeping. But truly, it is very sad. I think The New York Times now is the only standalone book review section in this country. And even a few years ago, there used to be the Los Angeles Times and Washington Post, and I guess the Chicago Tribune does the Printers Row, but it's digital now. It's not in print. There's a page. It's very sad of reviews. But I do think fragmentation has actually been good for translation. I think you're seeing a lot more communities grow up around this, and they're smaller, but they're strong. And so you're seeing more books as opposed to the one or two big books in translation. So I think for that, it has been good. And, you know, I beg, I borrow, and I steal. I just try booksellers, I try this media, I try people who don't review books, and I actually have to write when I say to them, I'm not asking you for a book review. Would you be interested in talking to this author? He's going to be here, and this is why. You know, it's you have to be incredibly creative. Some of it is marketing. Are you going to buy advertising? Are you going to spend? Are you going to... But a lot of it, and where I seem to have success, is doing what they're saying, being very specific, making that connection with media, with booksellers, doing your homework, and it's smaller, but it has the potential to reach the same number of people if you do it right. I mean, we're not going to go back to the 80s where there's huge numbers of books read and sold and the reviewed, but you can still hit a very decent pocket of people interested in a book through other means.
To follow up, I'm talking a lot about fragmentation, but there's one place that there's a lot of consolidation, which is in the distributors. I don't know how you interact with them, or how you with
Hardly at
books.
all. We interact, we order books for them, but it's a very cold.
You know, I presume that, you know, being in the New York ecosystem means that they're much less important to you than they would be out in Flywood.
Well, I mean, the distributors are a kind of tough spot because a lot of bookstores won't take anything unless it's through a distributor. We don't take anything on consignment, and no store that I've ever worked at will typically take something on consignment unless there's a very specific reason to.
There have been like 2 presses that have ever
Exactly.
ordered directly from.
It's. I mean, you're barraged with options. You're barraged with requests. It's sometimes easier to just have a hard and fast rule. So, I mean, my advice to any small presses that are looking to get their stuff in as many bookstores as possible is just cut those really awful deals and get those books in people's hands. I wanted to actually pivot what your answer to is that booksellers are reading those fragmented small review places. Booksellers are. I don't know if the lay public is typically, but a lot of people that are putting books in people's hands are reading those and can be responsible for getting a lot of books out there.
Yeah.
So.
I wanted to ask a question about Amazon Crossing. You know, Amazon Crossing is now, by some distance, the largest publisher of literature and translation in the country. I, at the Polish Cultural Institute, have been helping promote like the #1 best-selling Polish crime author who's just about to have a book out with Amazon Crossing. The book's not out yet, so I don't know what sales are like, but obviously they're not carried in bookstores. We had him in Chicago last week for a big festival of Polish literature, and of course we struggled to find bookstores that would take him for a venue. Amazon was trying to pair him with another author, and we had bookstores that were like, well, we'll do one Amazon author, but we really want to 2. And we finally ended up with him in a really excellent secondhand bookstore, and the event went great and all of this. I think probably like everyone in the room, I have super mixed feelings about Amazon. And I was just curious about whether you guys have had interactions with them, what those interactions were like, what your perspective was. My sense is that Amazon Crossing anyway, is really like learning and evolving, and there are some things that are getting better, and I hope that we're going to be in a place where they're acting more like a regular publisher in a lot of ways, and that they are easier for you guys to work with. Is that the impression that you've got?
The day they start paying their taxes, maybe we'll
At least we don't do any business with Amazon. We won't talk to Amazon Crossing. I appreciate the amount of attention that Amazon Crossing is dragging to translations, and I don't fault anyone for talking with them and figuring that out. But our bookstore and every bookstore I've ever worked at will not do an Amazon title. Amazon Crossing can be promising the moon, but Amazon itself is definitely a detriment to our industry.
And you're the one that didn't work at Melville House, right?
No, and I did not work at Melville House, but yeah.
And not
I'm
I
not
haven't
you.
either.
It's not only the industry, it's the whole country. I mean, and not only the
Right.
whole country, but the world. It is.
Yeah, you're
Right.
kind of asking the
It's,
I mean,
it is completely political, but we never out the business with them.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, and it's that's exactly the thing I was gonna say is like it's not just. I don't know. I feel like if it were just books,
It's
something like you would think about it differently. But it's like I don't know.
Amazon
There
Crossing is
was
not going to
a
sell you a refrigerator.
well
you know.
to support a company that I mean I don't know. There was like just a case about like Staples and Office Depot trying to merge, and like the fact that Amazon. I don't know. There's like all this shit about Amazon and them getting into business, like selling business supplies, and like there's all of this stuff that they are actually like I can't imagine in good conscience giving them $1 when really the stakes are so huge, like so big.
I mean,
Can I say something that just there are so many people who buy books from Amazon. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So I do think that there are people who want this. I think we're doing an event and you're trying to find people to help sell books. So your question is basically, do we ever deal with Amazon doing events or?
I mean, that's been more my immediate experience with Amazon. As I said, this particular book is not out yet.
Okay.
And so the actual issue of selling the physical copies has not yet come up. It's coming out in a month or two. But I'm very curious because Amazon, like the editors I've been speaking to at Amazon Crossing are very interested in doing more Polish literature. And I would love to talk to them about that, but I'm very, very skeptical because A, they have a lot of money, and B, they have a lot of ambition. So if they're going to be buying up high quality authors and printing them and having those books go nowhere, then that
Right.
really does absolutely nobody any good at all. You know, so I have sort of like a longer term strategic interest in this. Is, you know, is there a way that Amazon Crossing can be useful, or should I just be like, you know, like you guys are, like freezing them out entirely?
I mean, it's a really tough thing. And Amazon Crossing is the first time with Amazon that I've had to pause and like take stock of the situation because of the amount of exposure they're giving to translations. It's, but I took pause and.
But who's listen? Like, I don't know if they're giving exposure to translation. Like, what are they? Like, how much is that making a difference? Like, is Chad Post actually making more of a difference than everything Amazon Crossing is publishing? I don't know. I would be really sad if you published a great Polish novel and I could not in good conscience order it. That would make me so sad.
I think what you're hearing here today is the translation community in general depends a lot on booksellers like this to hand sell to get the word out. And these people are not going to be hand selling Amazon titles. Amazon may try to replicate what that is. They have physical stores now too, they're rolling out, and they try to do that online. You have to be the person to decide if that's the market that best fits that book, and if that's the audience you want to reach, and if you want to alienate people like this who are also interested in those kinds of books too. You may be reaching one market, but you might not reach another. So I think you just have to think about the whole country and the whole landscape and hear what they're saying and do your research.
And also, we're not like vicious people. So if you publish one thing with Amazon Crossing, it's not like we would say we'll never take any of your books with other publishers.
No, I'm always
You know, if you want to try, like if you try things out and you do something with Amazon Crossing, see how it does, do something else with a different publisher, like that seems like an interest. Like I would love to hear. Like I want to hear what the sales are. You know, it's so curious to
I'm really
me.
curious what the sales are.
That's a good question, Sean. I can only.
Time for one
more.
quick question.
Great. Go ahead.
So this is also a question about translators promoting the books that they translate, and I'm curious if I have the impression, just kind of anecdotally and from limited experience, that sometimes publishers are not that interested in the translators promoting the books that they translate. I don't know if it's kind of a feeling like, oh, if we can't get the author over here, you know, we're just not going to bother to have the translator do an event. We're just going to devote our time to something where we can actually have the author there. Whereas I think as translators, we're really in a great position to be really great spokespeople for the books that we translate. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've experienced, or perhaps that's not really the reason. Maybe it's just kind of, you know, they have limited bandwidth and they're not putting their resources into, they can't put the resources into everything. And then, you know, what do you think the translator's role is in promoting the books, and if publishers have been open to that, like in your experience?
Have any of you ever had just a translator do an event at your store?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Yeah.
we do.
All the time.
Or maybe a translator in conversation with someone who's a fan of the book.
So it doesn't. It does happen, and I think
Yeah.
it's happening more and more. I think what you have to do if you want to play a bigger role in publicity and you find your publishers pushing back, the thing I think that they are worried about sometimes is the budget and spending the money. They don't always want to pay for a translator to travel around and do a 6-city tour. That's probably not going to happen. But if you have some creative ideas on how you think you can get the word out, I can't imagine any publisher that's going to say to you, don't run with that. And even if you have maybe a limited budget, if you say, could you give me X $100 to buy one plane ticket, but I'm going to go and visit 6 bookstores on that one, you know what I mean? If you can think of a way to really make it worth their while, and I've even had translators sign stock. I mean, I like to have the translator present in the book as much as possible, but every publisher is different. If you are able to frame it such as you are helping that publisher get the word out about the book, I just can't imagine they wouldn't want you to do it.
So if you pitch specific ideas to the publicist, do you think that they're open to that? Or, I mean, they may not come up with it on their own, but go ahead and see if they...
I've always found it helpful. I've always found it helpful to do someone's job for them. Always, people love it. Try it. You'd be surprised. It is a good thing, and all they can say is no. And I say that to all of my authors. Try it. All they can say is no. And then what happens? You just go do something else. Do it on your own. Do it on your library. You know, do it online. You
Do it
can
on Facebook.
you can help a lot.
And you have at least 3 examples of bestseller with dead writers, recent ones, or at least writers who haven't been involved in publicity. It's Elena Ferrante, No Interview Never, Stieg Larsson, dead. Hans Verlader, Alone in Berlin, as well. Dead. I mean, and yeah, it's creativity. I mean, good text, creativity, and a lot of energy, and face. And yeah, sometimes it works.
And champagne. All right, so that is it for us. Thank you so much.